morning, everyone, and can I welcome to the 22nd meeting of 2018 of the Social Security Committee. Can I remind everyone present to turn off mobile phones or put them to silent mode as they can disrupt our meeting. Can I welcome Gordon Lindhurst this morning, who is coming along as the substitute Conservative member in place of Jeremy Balfour, who has sent his apologies. So you're more than welcome, Gordon. We move to agenda item 1, which is decision to take items in private. And the committee has asked you to agree that item 4, consideration of evidence, is taken in private. Has the committee agreed to that? Yes. Okay, thank you. We move to agenda item 2, social security and in-work poverty. And agenda item continues our inquiry into that particular topic and is our penultimate evidence session, so we're nearly there with a short focused inquiry. And can I welcome Donna Ward, DWP Policy Director, Children, Families and Disadvantaged, Pete Searle, DWP Policy Director, Working Age Benefits, and Denise Horsfall, DWP Universal Credit Area Director, Scotland. Thank you, all of you, for coming along this morning. You're very welcome and we appreciate your attendance. I know one of you is making a short opening statement, but I'm not actually sure which of you, so who's going to do that?
It's me, Donna Ward.
Donna, thank you. And you go.
Okay, thank you. Well, thank you so much for inviting us. I'd like to start by saying that we absolutely recognise that in-work poverty has increased. We now have 3.3 million adults in the UK in-work poverty, and 2/3 of children in poverty, and I know child poverty is such a big issue for you in Scotland, are now in families that work. So the whole composition of the population in poverty has shifted. And we absolutely recognise that, and the UK government has done quite a lot of work to try and understand that and to see what we can do about it and to check that all of our policies are consistent with helping to improve the situation. So most of this issue is kind of the flip side of a really good labour market. We now have 3/4 of all adults of working age are now in employment, so that's across the UK but also in Scotland. We've had 1 million fewer workless households since 2010, so it's really quite remarkable kind of change in the labour market since the financial crisis. And it's really about that rather than a really big shift in the underlying risk of being in work poverty. So the risk of being in work poverty has stayed quite flat at around 10% for working people. But I'm not going to sit here and say it's just about that. Of course, it's still much better to be in work. You're 5 times less likely to be in poverty as a child if you're in work. So, of course, that's still much better. And the risk hasn't fundamentally changed of being in poverty if you've been in work. But that's not the case for absolutely everyone. As we said in our written statement, which came in advance, we know that for children in poverty, after housing costs, the risks of being in work poverty have increased. So that's partly down to the kind of greater cost of private renting, but it's also to do with some aspects of the labour market. We know from the JRF report, which was really helpful on poverty in Scotland, that the risk of being in in-work poverty has increased for lone parents in Scotland. So there are issues there. And we've done some extensive analysis about who is in in-work poverty. So if you take the whole population in in-work poverty, it really breaks down to mostly being those families who are only working part-time, one-earner couples, and then low-earning self-employed people. So there is a small residual element of people where both couples are in full-time work, but actually full-time work within the household virtually eliminates in-work poverty for both the whole of the UK and for Scotland. So there's definitely something about working patterns and work intensity, and we believe that universal credit is really well designed to get people into work in the first place, but then also to smooth their incentives to work more. It's removed a lot of the cliff edges from the old tax credit system, and it's helped if people are worried about fluctuating earnings, or whether if they take a job, will they then lose their job? Are they going to have to navigate between 2 systems? And the incentives under universal credit have improved thanks to the recent budget measures. So the increase in the work allowance, that was the main thing that the JRF had recommended as a change to universal credit to help tackle in-work poverty. And of course, the UK government has been listening. So, of course, I know your main interest is in relative poverty. There's lots of different measures of poverty. And relative poverty, as you know, is the sum total of everything that happens in the benefit system, the labour market, but then also the wider macroeconomy. So it also obviously matters what happens to the median income line. And we know that relative poverty has improved after the financial crisis, but that was really because median incomes collapsed. But also relative poverty tends to stagnate when median incomes grow faster, and it's harder for poorer families to keep up. So it's quite a complicated picture in terms of what drives the final outcome on relative poverty. And the benefit system is one element of that, but it has to sit within a wider context. So that's why UC incentives, which are good and have improved, are being reinforced by increases to the living wage and also increases to the personal tax allowance. So you have to kind of see that all together, not just what's happening on the benefit side, but also wages and taxes. And then, of course, much wider government agendas also have to come together. So in terms of trying to get people to work more, it's not just about incentives, it's also about what employers are willing to offer. And all of the good work that the UK government's doing and you are doing to halve the disability employment gap, to eliminate the gender pay gap, and to make work fairer and decent for all comes into play alongside what happens in the benefit system. And finally, it's obviously much more likely to be in-work poverty if you have children. And so a big element of that, we know that one-earner couples tend to be one-earner couples because somebody's looking after the children, and lone parents also face barriers to working because they've got childcare responsibilities that they have to deal with on their own. So childcare is a really important element to this story as well. And universal credit is more generous on the childcare side than tax credits was. Alongside that, the UK government and the Scottish government is doing more to subsidise free childcare places. But it's not just about what government can do to subsidise childcare, it's also about the provision in the market and whether flexible childcare is available to people in kind of low-paid work. So I think what I hope I've managed to make the point that in-work poverty is kind of the collection of a lot of different things coming together, especially if you look at it in a relative sense. And the benefit system is one element within a wider context. And the UK government has been very concerned about this issue too, and has tried to see all of these elements together.
That's helpful, Donna Ward. It might be worth placing this inquiry into some context as well, because I mean, much of what you said there, which was helpful, mixed between delivery of the policy intent of the UK government and the policy intent of the UK government. We had hoped next week to have had the UK Secretary of State, Esther McVey, here, along with the Scottish Cabinet Secretary, h-Eileanan. This morning we received a reply from Alok Sharma, MP, the Minister of State for Employment, who has agreed to come to our committee, but waited 6 weeks for a reply from the Secretary of State. We got a reply this morning from the Minister of State. Unfortunately, they won't be available for this particular inquiry, and there are maybe some policy matters we'd wish to interrogate, and it's whether we interrogate that with DWP staff, lead staff, senior staff, or with the relevant politicians. Unfortunately, they are not available to us. Also note you put a number of statistics on the record there in relation to poverty, and I think those are quite crucial, because you were making a point about part-time employment and full-time employment, and the Poverty Alliance, who prepared a briefing for the Universal Credit debate in the Parliament last week, have stated that 1 million people in Scotland are living in the grip of poverty, including 230,000 children, that 65% of all children living in poverty living the poverty line are working households, and that 59% of all working age adults living in poverty live in working households. So obviously getting people into employment does not solve poverty in itself because of the nature of low paid, uncertain employment in Scotland and across the UK. Now that brings us to the merging of the tax credit system into universal credit, and the idea of putting conditionality on those quite often in part-time work who will no longer receive tax credits, but they will receive universal credit, and the idea that they will be asked or encouraged or eventually instructed to increase their hours of work or to increase their hourly rate or to take on a second job. These are all clear things that work coaches could request or eventually instruct individuals who are working to do. So we asked the PCS, we asked the workers' representatives in the job centres in relation to how realistic they thought it was to have a meaningful conversation with someone who is in work, to have that meaningful conversation, tailored conversation with them, to be realistic about what the expectations were to move into better paid employment if those opportunities actually exist at all. And David Semple from PCS told us the current number of work coaches simply would not be able to do that work in any meaningful way. Given the additional footfall of claimants into our job centres, the number of job centres has been cut over the past couple of years. As the committee will be aware, it would not be sustainable for work coaches to have meaningful conversations and to raise the kinds of questions that you have mentioned. That was myself talking about whether there was available opportunities for work, whether there was suitable childcare, whether there was suitable transport links, the whole gambit of things you would have to have a conversation with an individual about. So the union doesn't think it's achievable. They've said they think there has to be 5,000 additional staff in the system to make universal credit work, but here we are. It's rolling out. How would you respond to that?
I think that's one for me to start with, and Denise may want to come in. I mean, first of all, the points about in-work conditionality, there's a very light touch system in place now, so we're not asking work coaches to do that now. We would acknowledge that if we did want work coaches to start having intense conversations with people in work, that would require more resources, but that's not something we're asking them to do now. That's not a plan that we've got in place. So we ran a trial, the in-work progression trial that we published the results of back in September this year, that did test a range of different things that work coaches could do to help people progress in work. And I sort of stepped back a bit as well, that if we're concerned about in-work poverty, then people who could work more, I think we'd all like them to be able to work more. It's about how we can enable that, because that's something that could combat in-work poverty. So we ran that trial. Actually, that showed that if you did do some fairly intense things, and the intense things were at the most intense, it was an intervention after 8 weeks, so a 10-minute conversation with a work coach after 8 weeks, and then every 2 weeks after that, we would have a further conversation, face-to-face conversation with the person who was in work. That actually did lead to wage increases on average, so the people that had those interventions did work more. Now, we need a lot more evidence, a lot more research before we'll be in a position to say what the best way forward on this, because we don't have evidence at the moment about what really could work, what's the best way of interacting with people in work, because they've got jobs to go to. They don't need to be popping down to the job centre every 5 minutes. So we need to get that evidence. We've got funding from the budget, I think it was budget 2017, £8 million from the Treasury to do that sort of research over the course of 4 years. And by doing that, we'll learn what works and we'll think about the best way forward. But as things stand, we're not asking our work coaches to spend any significant amount of time helping those people in work to progress. Denise, did you want to add anything from that?
Can I just, before you come in there, Denise, because that raises some additional questions as much as it does answers. So you've said at this time it's a light touch approach, but it won't always be a light touch approach, and you've said that there will be no moving from a light touch approach until there are additional resources. For the avoidance of doubt, by moving away from a light touch approach, do you mean sanctions and conditionality on the working poor?
It could mean a whole range of things. That's what we want to.
But could it mean that?
To test.
Could it mean someone who's currently in receipt of tax credits moving over to universal credit have been told to get more hours or increase their pay, and if they're unable to do that, there could be a financial sanction on them? Is that what you mean by moving away from light touch?
As I said, it could mean a broad range of things. At
But
the
is
extreme,
that one of the things?
Conditionality would certainly be part of it, so that's one of the things that we look to test.
So that's a yes. That's important to know. Just for clarity, because you might speak at length and we don't actually get the clarity that we're looking for. So now you said there's need for additional resources. Now the PCS have said 5,000 more employees are required at the front line to have any kind of meaningful conversation. Is that a number you would recognise, Mr. Searle?
No, I don't recognise that number. I don't know on what basis the PCS would have calculated that, because they don't know what the intervention would be. We don't know what the intervention would be. We want to test, we want to learn, and when we've tested and learned, we'll work out what the best way forward is. Then we'll be able to work out what additional resources would be required. What I can say for sure is we're staffing our work coaches to do what we're currently asking them to do. If we ask them to do an awful lot more, we would need more resources. That's something we would have to work out in the light of the research.
Now, the PCS would see you're understaffing them for what you're asking them to do just now, especially if you look at the service centres where they just cannot cope with entries into online journals as things currently stand. How many additional workers minimum do you think would have to put in the system to allow meaningful... Because actually, we don't have to know what the conditionalities would be. We just have to know that the expectation is that Job Centre Plus or DWP expects work coaches to sit down and build up tailored relationships, build up trust with those in work at a job centre. That takes more staff. You must surely have a figure for how many more staffs need. You know how many people have the tax credit system. You know how many people are coming over through managed migration. You must surely know how much more staff you need in job centres to do this.
I think I've explained why it's impossible for us to know that at the moment, because we don't know what we want to do. If we wanted them to spend an hour a week with each of these people, that would cost a certain amount. If we wanted them to spend 10 minutes every month, that would cost an awful lot less and require a lot less resources. We are testing.
That's a really good reply. So could you tell me how many additional work coaches we need for an hour a week?
I couldn't, because I haven't got those numbers in front of me.
Can you tell me how much it would be for 10 minutes a month?
No, I haven't got those figures in front of me. All I'm saying is we've got a programme of work over the course of 4 years to find out what the right interventions are. We will develop that. How much it will cost, what extra resources would be required will be part of that. Now seems highly premature to have abstract conversations about, well, if it was 10 minutes, if it was an hour, what would that involve? I just don't have those figures.
It would seem pretty uncoordinated and poorly planned if you hadn't done some modelling work in relation to this. So have you done any modelling work in relation to how many... It seems if you agree with the PCS, additional staff are required. So what modelling work have you done to recognise that additional staff are required to have meaningful conversations with the working poor that are going to have conditionality placed on them? So what work have you done in relation to that?
I think I've made it very clear that we're looking at this over the course of the next 3 or 4 years to work out what extra interventions we'd require. Then, as part of that, we will model what the workload implications and the resourcing implications are of that. I don't see why 3 or 4 years ahead of actually doing something, we would have modelled what the impact might be under various different scenarios. We haven't done that research to the best of my knowledge, and I think it would be premature to have done so.
Okay, I'm not sure I agree with you, but that's the answer. Alasdair Allan?
Thank you, Convener, and thank you for appearing here today. I think it would be interesting to pursue some of the lines of inquiry around what the PCS said to us in evidence at our last hearing, and give you the opportunity to respond to some of what's been said. The Convener has already raised some of the issues. I suppose the issues I'm keen on finding out about are about the general state of preparedness of the system to cope with the rollout of universal credit. For instance, one issue that was raised was, and one thing I questioned last week was about the digital first approach to dealing with people who come through the system. I just wonder, can you offer some comment on the state of preparedness internally to cope with this, and B, the capacity of such a system to cope with people who simply don't have access to the internet, given the serious claims that were made by the PCS in their evidence that the system is prepared for neither?
Okay. So my accountability, excuse me, my accountability is to make sure that we're prepared. So the first thing is resources, so I'll take that first. Certainly our resources, I'm running at a higher rate than expected. So I've got, against my allocation in the department for Scotland, for work coaches, I'm around about between 100 and 150 on paper, too many work coaches. Now, that isn't too many in my view, because I'm preparing for increase in caseloads as we migrate to roll out. So that's not in work, that's people that are out work or people who are making a new claim to benefit. We're seeing many more people, remember, that are pre-work capability assessments. We're seeing them from day one. So in work coach terms, I am comfortable we're on the right trajectory. For case managers, I'm well below the average expected at this point in time for caseloads. So again, what I've done is looked forward, made sure that we're in advance of the curve, made sure that our resources in each of the service centres are on an ongoing build to keep pace with the rollout as it goes up to December. So that's the resources. Sorry, the second part of the question.
Well, the question, I suppose, is
digital.
the question is about whether the digital first approach is either going to work internally or going to work for people who don't necessarily have access or ability to contact you by those means.
Yeah, so it depends where you are in the country. So if we're in the Central Belt, there is lots of provision to support customers. We make contact with our partners in the locality, and also I think you went to Dundee, you saw what we've done in the front of house where we've put digital access and people to support people when they come in to get digital access. Now that's the same in every single job centre. We've also...
Just to interrupt you then, you raised an important point there about depends where you are in the country. I apologise for breaking your flow, your train of thought there, but you say it depends where you are in the country. I should say at this point that I represent the Western Isles. And if you live in US, there aren't even any job centres within 100 miles.
Right.
So how does it work in that situation?
So in that situation, firstly, what we do is we contact the customer, we see when they're available. If they can't get across to the mainland, then what we're doing is either sending a visiting officer the other way, or what we're trying to do is make sure that we take the claim over the phone and then progress it. When the individual can come in, because they do need to sign their claim commitment, they do need to have a conversation. And then what we're trying to do is do it through journals and through the phone. So, you know, where it's appropriate to actually bring somebody in because they need more intensive support, because some of that provision that they might need might be on the mainland rather than on the island. But generally, that's the process.
Because picking up on that, and this is relevant across the country, not just to rural areas, one of the issues that was raised in our last evidence session was about the potential unintended consequences, not so much of going digital, because everybody accepts that is the future, if you like, but for the very significant minority of people who simply can't or are unable to access that system. One of the issues that was put to us in the evidence really was that that group of people not being able to access the system online will lead, in the view of the unions, to a large increase in pressure on the telephone option, if you like, and will lead to delays in applications and contact being processed simply because of that pressure that will be created on the phone system. So is that a claim you would understand or accept?
It's not the experience. I mean, it is an issue that we are working hard to make sure either people are connected to services to support them, or actually, you know, there is a telephony service as well. But it is digital first, as you said. So it is building the competence and capability of the individuals that are making the claims. Lots of our services across the whole of the UK and in Scotland are going online. For me, I'm not seeing that impact on the claiming process. the process is you make a claim online, you're then directed to phone to make an appointment. And at that stage, our phone service identifies if anybody needs any special support. And that could be that they can't get in, or that actually they've got health issues and need a visiting officer. If somebody then doesn't proceed to contact us, even if they've made the appointment, we're on the phone trying to make sure that we don't lose anybody through this new process, which is, you know, we've got to accept it's new. It's a transformation of services for the citizens of Scotland. Therefore, they need some support to understand how to navigate it.
And just pick up on that point, if you find in the course of the next X months that there are delays or problems around that, would that be enough to consider pausing rollout while you sorted those problems, or would you press ahead?
Well, we're 90% through new claim rollout, so I haven't seen that to date. Yes, there will be people that need further support. There'll be people that are referred to us from third sector. There'll be people we refer to partners. But
and finally then, thank you, Convener, for trying your patience, but finally, we do also have evidence from the Westminster Public Accounts Committee about the wider attitude of the DWP when presented with problems. They've said that I quote, the department's systematic culture of denial and defensiveness in the face of any adverse evidence presented by others is a significant risk to the programme. Are they wrong on that?
That may be more of a policy question than an operational question, I would guess. But I mean, I think if you look back at the last year, so in budget 17, we introduced 100% advances. We extended the repayment period to 12 months. We introduced a run-on of housing benefit for 2 weeks. We got rid of the 7-day waiting days. Then in June 17, we addressed issues that people had raised around severe disability premium. In the budget, we've increased work allowances, which is something that have been put, I think, to this committee. We've reduced the deduction rate from 40 to 30%, again, raised with this committee. We've introduced a further run-on for job seekers allowance, income support, employment support allowance. We've changed the approach for the self-employed by bringing in a broader 12-month grace period. So, to me, that is a sign of a government and a department that is listening and responding to try and make this system work as well as possible. I can't really see how, with those facts, you can say that we haven't been listening.
And can I add to that, Mr. Allan? Because, you know, I see Child Poverty Action Group probably about every 4 months. And my team work with John Dickey's team in between. They've got an early warning system. We look at that early warning system to try and understand if there's any trends. So I certainly think we listen from an operational sense. That's just one stakeholder. Citizens Advice Scotland, Scottish Federation for Housing. I see them regularly and we take information from them from an operational sense. And we tend to talk about two things. One's the policy context and one's the operational context. So, I think we are.
My deputy convener was quite right. We should mention to that we should maybe just check a couple of figures that we got last week from the PCS, and I appreciate that my initial questioning was concerns that the unions had raised in relation to workload, but figures that come up last week were that the caseload for work coaches could go from significantly below 100 to estimated 343, and a second figure we had was those in the service centres who are having to look at these online journals. Their caseloads could go up to almost 900. Now that seems incredible, but these figures must have came from somewhere. PCS recognised those figures. They've clearly looked at what they think the increased workload to be, and those are the ones that were discussed last week, and the committee was genuinely deeply alarmed by that increase in workload. I guess it brings us back again. I don't want to flog a dead horse, I really don't, but it brings us back again to what, Ms Horsfall, you're having to deal with the management of workload for the teams out there. What numbers would you recognise?
So we are less than the average nationally, and that is less than 80 at the moment per work coach, which is, I think, or 85, the figure that PCS quoted. And certainly our case managers, the average is around, at the moment, 330.
Okay, and you would agree that will increase over the next few years?
It will certainly, well, it's activity. Certainly, if I can I talk about the workload for case managers? So workload for case managers is the activity on the caseload. So the more automation there is to payments, the less activity there will be. So caseloads will rise, the more automation we get. So it's a force thought that there is a limit that's unworkable. The issue is that we're working on what is a reasonable caseload for case managers, what can they do? What we want them to do is clear the work so that customers are certainly serviced in the way that we want. And at the moment, that's happening. Now, in work coach terms, it comes back to what Mr. Searle said, which was that actually at this time, the numbers are not at the level that PCS are quoting. They're obviously quoting something from somewhere I don't recognise. I'm sorry, I don't recognise for some time in the future. Now, presumably, they've looked at the whole population and divided that by the number of people we've got now. Well, that's not the reality. We've already talked about we need to understand what the system will be, and then we'll resource it appropriately.
Look, that's helpful. It's just there's generally a disconnect between the union representing the workers on the ground and DWP in relation to what workload looks like, or we wouldn't have had that evidence last week, and we're just very keen as a committee to make sure that ends, and the alarming statistics we heard last week are addressed in a meaningful way that improves the service for people on the ground that are very worried about what universal credit means for them. But I have to let other committee members in. I am now testing the patience of my committee members. Mr. Searle, briefly.
Just very, very briefly, I mean, just to add to that point, we would expect those caseloads to go up over time for a range of reasons. One is that actually the mix of cases changes. So the mix of cases on UC now, universal credit now, is fundamentally sort of unemployed people who we see every 2 weeks. So that requires quite a lot of activity. The new cases, many of them will be less intensive regimes, so actually work coaches can increase their caseload. The other point is a lot of these work coaches are new, so they're building up their experience. So over time, the average experience of a work coach will increase, and they'll be able to deal with more cases. So a number of reasons why we'd expect it to increase, and for that to be okay.
I think a lot of us just can't. We bring my deputy leader in a second. Yeah. Yep.
I just would like to press you on this, because I find that unbelievable what you've just said there. So we know that there's going to be a migration from people on tax credits who are currently administered by the HMRC. So how can you possibly say that you don't expect the workload to increase when you're going to take tens of thousands of people into the DWP system that previously weren't? That does not...
The total workload will increase, but then as we bring people on tax credits across and increase the universal credit population, so we increase the number of work coaches. So it's the average per work coach I'm talking about. So absolutely, yes, the workload will increase. But when I say again that tax credits cases, particularly with the very light touch conditionality regime we've got, they don't require that much activity from work coaches. Someone who's unemployed and actively seeking work, that requires quite a lot of activity. So the mix is really important.
I think what you're getting, Mr. Searle, is just that you should go back and look at the official report from last week if you didn't catch it before you came along to the committee, because that whole discussion about a work coach is going to have with someone who's maybe in a part-time employment about how far it's reasonable to travel to get a second job, to bring up to full-time hours, what the transport links are like, what that means for childcare, what that means for caring issues if they're a carer with other people in their family. That takes a lot of knowledge and sensitivity and relationship building with an individual for a work coach to do. And PCS assured us they believe that they have workers at the front line who have got the skills to do that. What they don't have is enough of them, and they don't have enough time. So that's the disconnect, and there's a difference of opinion between yourselves and what the unions have said. But I think it's just fair to put that on the record. I think that's where the disconnect comes. We'll go to Mark Griffin.
Thank you, Camira. Good morning. You will know that many members here have a concern about the single household payment and universal credit, and members of this Parliament across all parties unanimously supported an amendment to the Social Security Act to start discussions between the Scottish Government and the UK Government about implementing automatic split payment and universal credit in Scotland. Can I just ask while you hear about the progress of discussions on that policy?
Well, that's something in principle we've agreed to do. It's prerogative of the Scottish Government to request that change. I think we're in discussions now about exactly what the nature of the policy that the Scottish Government would want to have around split payments would be, and once we know that, then we can work through what it would take to deliver that and what the timetables might be. But it's that sort of discussion that I understand is going on now. We've already introduced the other flexibilities around payments to landlords and around more frequent payments, but the split payments one is something we're still discussing with the Scottish Government.
Okay. Members have had a concern about the single payment and universal credit, and I fear that would exacerbate situations of domestic abuse. And the reason I asked that is because I wanted to move on to the managed migration and the natural migration process. Now, through the managed migration process, people moving from tax credits to universal credit will thankfully receive transitional protection. But those who move in the natural migration process through a change in circumstances, say perhaps a breakdown in a relationship, will not receive transitional protection. Now, similarly to the concerns that we have about a split payment, I would have concerns that the managed migration process attracting transitional protection would affect people's behaviour, in that it could encourage a woman who's experiencing domestic abuse to stay in that abusive relationship, so that they would get the transitional protection with a managed migration process rather than going through the natural migration process. What's your view on that?
Well, I think, step back a bit, I mean, clearly the most important thing here is to address the fundamental domestic abuse, which is something we'd all be firmly in favour of stopping through whatever means possible. I mean, there are currently single payments across the whole of the benefit system already, so it's not as though we're moving to a very different place. I think the natural migrations and managed migrations point, if someone splits up and effectively it's a new claim at that point, then their circumstances have changed quite dramatically. So I'm not sure what you would transitionally protect if they moved across to universal credit, because their claim circumstances are very different. But what I can say is, we take great care to make sure our work coaches, and one thing I think me and the PCS would agree on is that our work coaches are absolutely fabulous and extraordinarily capable people, take great care in making sure they're alive to and aware of domestic abuse issues and know how to respond to that. So most important that they can link up with other organisations locally to try and help people with that fundamental problem.
Okay.
And sorry, can I just add that I did see the transcript with the evidence from the PCS, and they did mention, of course, they did acknowledge that quite a lot of people do actually gain from moving over to universal credit. So they were also quite keen not to slow down migration or stop it completely, given that there were a lot of families, especially those people working very few hours, who would gain from the new system. It's not just a one-way thing that, people would automatically have less money.
Yep, I think PCX acknowledged that there would be winners and losers, but from the analysis that we've seen, that one of the losers would be lone parents. One of the big losers in the system would be lone parents and disabled people. So that then raises the concern as to whether a mother would choose to stay in an abusive relationship to protect the financial stability of the children, and that's why I raised the question. But if I could move on to another issue that I raised and discussed with PCS last week, was about fluctuating earnings, in particular an example in my own region where a local authority pays their workers on a 4-weekly cycle and will be paying their workers early in December before staff leave for Christmas, and the impact that is going to have on their universal credit claim where because of the number of payments within a particular month, that they will receive no universal credit. And the PCS representative last week said that there were technical options available to them that in previous systems. They have looked at smoothing earnings out over a 12-month period to stop something like that happening. Are you looking at what technical options there are available to stop something like that happening?
We're certainly aware of the issue, but that monthly assessment period is an absolutely fundamental core part of the universal credit system, and that does. And the reason it's monthly is because the majority of employees get paid monthly. So if we had any other assessment period, if we had a fortnightly assessment period or something, then some fortnights we get all the payment, and other fortnights we get none of the earnings, and so universal credit will go bouncing up and down greatly. So that's why we've got a monthly assessment period. It does, as you rightly say, mean that for those employees who are paid on a 4-weekly cycle, there will be months in the year when, for our universal credit calculation, we're seeing 2 lots of earnings. It might be 1 or 2 months in the year. What I would say is that those are predictable. So we want our work coaches and the individuals to see those things coming and to try and budget. And we can help people currently with local authorities, but also with from April with the citizens' advice, help people to build budgeting skills. But we think budgeting to cope with those periods is the most important thing, and what we can do in the short term, rather than anything more structural around universal credit. One other point I'd make on fluctuating earnings, actually, particularly at the bottom of the labour market, there is an awful lot of earnings fluctuation that people have, not necessarily the full weekly point, but they could be paid monthly or weekly. Universal credit is very helpful in that respect, because if someone's earnings are high one week or 1 month, then universal credit will be slightly lower, so it will smooth the income. If their earnings are low another month, then universal credit will rise. So actually universal credit helps in those circumstances to give people a slightly smoother, more predictable level of income from month to month.
Okay, and what exactly are work coaches doing with claimants to help them predict how much universal credit they'll get in each month?
I mean, it's something we're looking to build up with work coaches. So as part of their relationship with people, to see those sort of patterns of earnings, and then through the journal, through communication with the customer, help them to see that coming, that point coming where they do have 2 payments, and recognise that their universal credit will drop. We're certainly making sure that our work coaches ensure that people, if they do need to reclaim universal credit afterwards, they can be helped to do that sort of rapid reclaim rather than any sort of longer term process. I don't know if you want to add anything, Denise.
Yeah, so the arrangements locally is to pick up those points. Where are the employers that actually the wage cycles are predictable, and therefore when can we expect somebody to not receive universal credit, for example, in December because of 2 wages maybe, and therefore they've got to make a reclaim in January? Or is it okay because it is just fluctuating, as Mr. Searle says? So the other side of that is in budgeting terms, each of the work coaches know who their support systems are around budgeting support, either through the local authority or through citizens' advice or through charities. So it is about wrapping around that support and also bringing them into the job centre as well.
Thank you. Okay. Well, is that a supplementary or a question, Pauline?
No, it's Melanie question.
Okay. Pauline McNeill.
Thank you very much. There's a few different areas I want to ask you about, and I'm quite keen to get some stuff on the record so I clearly understand what you're saying. Can I begin with the transition of tax credit and child's tax credit, which I mentioned earlier? Could you just clarify at the moment, those families or those individuals, is that calculated on a monthly basis?
Tax credits. I think tax credits probably fortnightly. I'm not sure, but I don't think that's monthly. Well, actually, tax credits is on an annual basis, and then it's paid. Yeah, so it's assessed with a forecast essentially of earnings over the course of the year.
That's what I thought. It's just that you said in answer to Mark Griffin that the reason that you use the monthly assessment is that's what the majority of people do, but there will be literally millions of people who have tax credits calculated on an annual basis. So surely you accept that that does not fit with the model.
I think the problem with the annual assessment on tax credits is actually that huge numbers of people have ended up owing a lot of money back to the system because the reassessment periods are so infrequent. Actually tying the subsidies for low-paid work with an annual tax assessment doesn't actually fit in with a lot of people's experiences. So I think one of the things that we know with people moving across from tax credits is actually a lot of people have built up debt to government through the tax credit system, and I think that's something that universal credit is going to make sure it does not replicate.
On a monthly basis, people might actually, because you have admitted that the fact that you're saying that people may have to try to budget would indicate that you think there will be month-to-month losses for many families.
It will smooth out in the sort of cases we're talking about. Over a period of time, the amount they receive from universal credit will be pretty well the same as if they were paid monthly. It's just that there will be that month where it goes down, and other months it will be potentially slightly higher. So it's smooth. The issue that Donna raises is quite right around tax credits, where you do, because it's I would say quite a clunky annual reassessment system. Then people do find that what they received last year was either much more than they should have done, or actually sometimes less, and that leads to debts or money that's due to them. Universal credit tries to correct that by making sure it's calculated on a monthly basis, on the basis of what people have actually earned, have been paid by their employer in that month, and adjusting universal credit accordingly. That takes a lot of the burden off of customers as well.
So I think the director of Universal Credit himself said that probably most people don't know that they will be transferring from the HMRC system to the DWP. Would you accept that?
I don't know whether most people would know or not. I think universal credit has received quite a lot of coverage, it seems to me, so I think people will know a reasonable amount about it. And what I would say about the timetable, and I think this is, it's highly public but not necessarily very well known, is that we've now, as Denise said, pretty well rolled out new claims on universal credit across the country. So we're sort of 90% there, and by the end of this calendar year, essentially, all new claims to those benefits will be to universal credit rather than to tax credits or something like that. Then you've got the stock of cases on existing benefits like tax credits. We will be testing in the latter part of next year and the months that follow into 2020, testing in a very light touch way, something like 10,000 cases in total. That migration process, because it's really, really important we get that right for all of our customers, but particularly for the more vulnerable. And it's not until 2020, the latter part of 2020, that we would start to move people across in a large scale way, and we will do that through until 2023. So I think if we started warning people now who might move in 2021, that would feel premature to me. Now, clearly, we need to make sure we give them plenty of notice, and that's our absolute determination to do that. But we haven't started warning people individually now because it's so far away.
So earlier you challenged the figures that were outlined to you by Convener Bob Doris that were given to us by PCS. So I've had a chance to check that, but the figures that Bob Doris is quoting, so that workload increase for work coaches is the figures from the National Audit Office and not PCS, which say that the work caseload of individual work coaches by 2024 will be that figure of 919. Were you aware of that? Because you seem to challenge the PCS figures.
I think we challenged the figures. We just said we didn't entirely recognise them. If they're from the National Audit
They
Office
are.
report,
They are.
I can accept that. And I know the National Audit Office did.
So can I ask Denise Horsfall then? I seem to get the impression earlier that you didn't really acknowledge that there would be a significant increase for work coaches earlier.
I think I'm dealing with this year and next
Okay.
year. Yeah, I'm not dealing with managed migration. Managed migration, in my mind, is a decision about how we intervene with customers, all wrapped up with that. What do we do within work? All of those decisions still need to be made. So how can I agree or disagree? Really, I
Well,
can't.
because the National Audit Office have published these figures.
Well, fine.
So you don't accept them?
No, I'm not saying I
don't
don't
accept
accept
them.
them. I can only recognise that that's what the National Audit Office say. What I'm saying is my experience is delivery this year and
Right.
next year. I know I've got enough resource to actually
So
manage
really the
business.
panel are really not in a position then to challenge any of the figures at the moment because you'd say you don't know.
But as I said, I don't think we have challenged them. We've just said we didn't recognise this. If they're in the
You don't
National Audit
recognise
Office
them.
report,
Fair
then
enough. You
that
don't
is what the
recognise
National
them.
Audit Office have
Fine.
said. I think I was quite clear in saying we recognise that caseloads would increase and would increase quite significantly for the reasons that I set out earlier on.
Okay.
And that we feel that actually is perfectly well within the bounds of what work coaches can do because of the change in the mix of cases and because of the automation that Denise referred to and because of the level of experience. Those precise figures may or may not be
Okay,
right.
thank you. So just finally, I just want to press you a wee bit more then on what your evidence is in relation to light touch. Okay. So is it your understanding, how long will the light touch regime remain in place? Because I think it's an interesting use of language. I mean, I might be reading this wrongly, but the way I'm reading it is that it might be short term, and I just wondered if I'm wrong about that. And if what factors would be taken into account, because obviously light touch is kind of a meaningless phrase. For example, so as I understand it, so a claimant or someone who's in work claiming universal credit would be expected to aim to earn 35 hours on the living wage and reach that progression. So what factors will be taken into account by work coaches in this light touch regime?
Shall I start, Denise? And you want to, yeah. I mean, I think 35 hours is if someone is in a position to work 35 hours a week. So if someone's got care and responsibilities, disability, something else that means that 35 hours a week is not appropriate for them, then that figure would be smaller. It could be 24, could be 16. It depends on their
The
circumstances.
discretion of the work coach, or will you be issuing guidelines that these are the sorts of things that can be discounted?
I mean, Denise may be better than me on exactly what material work coaches have, but always
I think
it would
that's
be at
quite
the discretion
important to understand
within
because I would like, well, you would expect people would want to know, so if you have sick children, if you yourself have health issues, if you're looking after elderly parents, and the consequences of moving from what might be a secure job to an insecure job, I would presume these are all factors that your work coaches would take into account. So really I'd like to press you on, are you giving discretion to individual work coaches or will you be issuing guidance to administer that?
Do you want to answer the question on the basis of current system, and I can then come back to the light touch point, because I think this is fundamentally now about people out of work.
Absolutely. So answering for people that are out of work at the moment, rather than what you're trying to get to, which is in-work support. At the moment, people arrive, you know this, we do the claimant commitment, we sit down and over a period of meetings, try and identify with the individual what they can do and what they can't do. And if somebody's perfectly capable, has just come out of a job, full-time job, what they're obviously going to be looking for is a full-time job. If that's what they tell us and they haven't actually, circumstances haven't changed and they've got any other barriers. But obviously if somebody's come to us and they're not working at the moment for whatever reason, then it's that we're trying to identify to make sure that whatever we do is personalised and reasonable. What we don't want to do is get to a position where we're asking people to do something or working with them and they agree to do something they can't. That's the worst of all scenarios. So that's how we work at the moment. If I give guidelines, the danger is somebody will go, Well, if somebody's a lone parent, then I'll ask them to do 16 hours. If they're somebody who can't work because of other barriers, they can do 2 hours. I think this is about trust, relationship building, and making sure it's personalised at every turn.
And go back to the PCS point. I think our work coaches are highly capable of doing that, and we've done a lot of work to professionalise them further. On the light touch point, I just go back. We have got 4 years worth of funding to develop our understanding of what would work and hence what we want to do around this. We have no plans, as I speak, to change from that. Essentially, not doing much in terms of interventions for those people in that light touch conditionality regime. So we're not, as things stand, we're not asking work coaches today, tomorrow, or in a year's time to do anything in particular. When we do work that out, then we're happy to come and talk to you again about our plans, but that's not something we have at the moment.
And it might be worth adding, Mr. Searle sort of reminded me, which is it's the accreditation process. So about a third of our work coaches over the last 2 years have gone through accreditation or apprenticeships. So this is 14 months or up to 18 months worth of work on City of Guilds, and it is making sure that what we do is deepen the expertise of the work coaches so that in operational profession they really do understand and investigate how they can build their capability even further with support from tutors.
Thank you.
Okay. Michelle Ballantyne, I know you wanted to follow up a couple of supplementaries with the Deputy Convener's question. I know things have moved on, but would you want to come in now anyway?
Yes, I would. Thank you and good morning. Can I just check the question that was asked about the National Audit Office figures around caseload? I mean, that was the average UK figure. When you initially answered, were you talking about UK or were you talking about Scotland?
Scotland.
Right, so that would account for the difference in the figure.
Well, yes. I mean, we're always at different trajectories around recruitment and people in post and attrition, of course.
Right. And the other one, just a supplementary around conditionality that came from earlier as well. There's a tendency sometimes to talk about conditionality as though it's about penalising people. But my understanding is that it's actually about moving people on. So it's actually about engaging with them to how you take forward their opportunities within work and how they negotiate better, how they look and improve their work chances. And that's about how they move out of poverty. So can you just sort of clarify around conditionality? Because conditionality and sanctions are kind of framed in the same way, and they do have a relationship, absolutely, as I understand it. But can you just confirm, when we talk about conditionality, what are we actually talking about?
You're absolutely right. So we're talking about, primarily now through the claimant commitment, the relationship we build up, our work coaches build up with claimants, is what is the reasonable expectation that we can have of them, they can have of themselves to look for work, and that will depend, in the sort of way that Denise talked about, on their personal circumstances. But there is an expectation that they should make a commitment to, look for certain types of jobs, spend a certain number of hours each day looking for jobs. That's the conditionality, and actually that relationship with the work coach, the feedback we've had from a great majority of claimants is very positive. Now, there is a difference of view, I suspect, between the Scottish Government and the UK Government around sanctions. If you have conditionality, the UK Government would believe that at the end of the day there has to be something, something sitting behind that if someone doesn't do what they've committed to do in return for the benefit payment the taxpayer is giving them, then there should be some consequence of that, and that's where sanctions come in. But sanction rates, are actually pretty low. So currently in universal credit, and I can go into more detail about this if you like, but in universal credit, it's only about 3% of people are being sanctioned at the moment. It's a small minority of the caseload. The other 97% are operating fully in line with their claimant commitment, and many of them are moving into work as a result.
And in terms of the testing period for conditionality, you've said that you're going through a period now, starting now and going forward, on looking at what works. So when you say what works, what you mean, I assume, is the success rate of people increasing their earnings, getting into appropriate work, and basically moving out of poverty. Is that what you mean when you talk about testing? And will those results be published? Will they be easily accessible to us? Will we be able to follow that progress and know how it's going?
I would entirely expect that to be the case. I mean, I don't think we've got those detailed research plans yet. That's something we're working up, but it would be exactly that. So someone, how long, if someone's moved into work, but it's, a low number of hours, low earnings, and we think they're capable of doing more, then how long should we give them before we start, ringing them up, contacting them and saying, well, perhaps you could do more, let's come in and have a chat about that. That'd be one of the things we test, would a shorter period be better or a longer period? What's the best way of contacting that person? If they're working, certain hours, then actually it may be highly inconvenient to get them into the job centre. Maybe it's better to do something over the phone. We could test that, or test face-to-face. Is it 10 minutes? Is it something rather longer? What sort of additional support might they need? So, it could be conversations about childcare, transport, a whole range of things. So looking at different ways of doing it and looking at the impact both on the person while we're trying to help them to increase their earnings, so at that initial point, but also the final impact in terms of progression, which the whole purpose of this inquiry is around in-work poverty, so progression must be a good thing.
Can I just say one thing on in-work conditionality? Because we've talked a bit as if tax credits didn't have any conditionality, but actually you could only claim tax credits if you were working 16 hours and then it was 24 and 30 for couples. So actually, with universal credit being available to people even only working 1 hour, it is a very different system. So on the one hand, it's expecting, it's being far more generous, but obviously for all of the reasons that we've been talking about around children being in poverty and other things, we don't want people to just work very few hours. But I think I just wanted to clarify that obviously in the tax credit system there's a very hard-edged conditionality that you don't qualify at all unless you're working a particular number of hours.
Thank you. Can I go on to the other things, or do you want to come back to me?
Can I bring you back?
Yeah,
in?
that's fine.
Because I'm testing the patience of a number of members just now, including your own there, Alison Johnson. I will bring you back in.
Some of the areas we've touched on already. I mean, I've had the experience of attending a hearing with regard to sanctions with a constituent who'd been sanctioned for his failure to attend 2 meetings at the same time that he hadn't arranged, one to sign on and one to attend an interview. Now, his appeal was upheld, and the judge who heard it felt he was seeing too much of similar cases. Now, that clearly wasn't a case. You couldn't describe that light touch in any shape or form. The person concerned had then to apply for crisis loans in order to support their family. So I think, whether or not this is light touch or the heaviest touch possible, this is a world first. I think you're unprecedented in introducing in-work conditionality. And I'd like to understand why it's, it seems to me that there isn't an evidence base at the moment to suggest that this is a good idea, or it's one that will have the positive outcomes that you're seeking. So I'd like to ask for a bit more on who decided this was a good idea in the first place.
Shall I start, Donna?
Well, I don't know whether we should just come back to the point that in tax credits, you obviously have to work a certain number of hours to qualify, whereas obviously in universal credit, you can get the in-work benefit by just working only 1 hour. So, having some consistency between what people out of work experience and what people in work experience and what the taxpayer is expected to fund, I think brings the whole system, to bring the whole system into alignment. You wouldn't have conditionality for people not working and then no conditionality for people working 1 hour. I think it's about it being one system, but obviously then tailored according to people's hours and what could be expected of them. But you go on, Pete.
I mean, just a few points quickly in addition. I mean, I don't know about that particular sanctions, those sanctions cases. My guess is they were out of work cases rather than in work, because I'm not aware of any significant number of sanctions for people in work. I would never describe our conditionality regime for people out of work who are expected to look full-time for a job. I wouldn't describe that as light touch. That it is what it is, but that's not the light touch regime. The light touch regime is for people who are in work at the moment. Effectively, that light touch is so light touch that we have no expectations of people. When you say there isn't an evidence base, I mean, I think in a way you're agreeing with me. I'm saying there isn't an evidence base, and that's why we want to carry on getting more evidence of what could work. If that shows that actually it doesn't work and we're better off leaving people alone and letting them progress in their own right, then that could be our conclusion, and we don't change our policy.
People are being used as guinea pigs. People on low incomes who may be very vulnerable in the first place are testing out a system effectively.
Well, right now, no. I mean, we have had one trial, but we will have further trials. You could look at it another way, and I personally would look at it another way. Is, again, I come back to the point, fundamentally we're here talking about in-work poverty. So we have a customer who is in work and they are poor, and we feel they could do more work, they could increase their earnings. Wouldn't it be a failure in our organisation not to think about, not to work with them, not to try to develop a programme, not to test things that could help that person to progress? I think if we were doing nothing, you'd be criticising us for that. I mean,
Could do more, of course. You could be providing, childcare costs up front, for example. But we've got a couple of cultural shifts here. I mean, in-work conditionality, it's a shift for people claiming. It's also a shift for DWP staff. There's another cultural shift. I mean, people on tax credits at the moment may not even feel that they are claimants. And I'd like to understand how much work has been done in making sure that they know, that they're aware of the fact that they're going to have to make a claim. Has the DWP put resources into making sure that those people know that they will be expected to claim? What will happen if they don't claim? Will they simply be left without any money at all?
I mean, you raise an extraordinarily important issue around managed migration and how we're going to make that work. I set out earlier on the timetable for that and what we're going to be doing very carefully over the course of the next, essentially it's 2 years before we start making those changes in a large-scale way, is working out what works, working out how best to communicate with our customers. Because some people will respond straight away to a letter, other people, may not. They may have vulnerabilities. We need to test those things. We are working extraordinarily closely with stakeholders. The department had a big conference around managed migration with a full range of stakeholders about a month ago. That was kicking off that process. How can we work together to co-design the process to try and make sure that we do smoothly move people across to universal credit? We're absolutely determined to get that right. We're determined to work with people to design that correctly, and that is what we're going to be doing over the next 1 to 2 years.
I mean, Professor Sir Ian Diamond has expressed concerns that people may simply fall out of the social security system, and he has spoken of an unreasonable level of risk being put onto the claimant. I mean, do you share those concerns?
I mean, that's what we're determined to avoid by doing what I just set out, by having that sort of intensive period over the course of the next 1 to 2 years of testing, making sure we're designing that correctly to address the very concerns that Sir Ian Diamond set out in that SAC report. So we're determined that no one should fall through the net. And we're going to work very closely with the full range of stakeholders to design a system that hopefully delivers that.
I hope so too. It's certainly, one of the main drivers of universal credit was a simpler system, and I don't know how colleagues feel, but it seems remarkably complicated at the moment, and I do hope we get there one day. Thank you, Convener.
Okay, thank you. George Adam?
Convener, good morning. Where to start? We've heard quite a lot here this morning. I'll probably go back to the beginning. And during Donna Ward's initial statement, she said, we, the DWP, believe that universal credit is really well designed. Now, we've had a debate on Tuesday that says the exact opposite of that in this stage. But you also said, Pete Searle went on to say, in-work conditionality will be very light touch. And then you further added to that by saying very light touch conditionality regime within the in-work scenario. Now, surely these statements, with everything that's happened up until now with universal credit, surely these statements are nonsense, because that's not what we've been seeing in the real world. Surely there is no credibility for the DWP in these statements.
Well, I disagree. Sorry, Donna.
On the analysis of in-work poverty, which we've done quite a lot of, I was saying that once we broke down the population in in-work poverty, the key issues were around one-earner couples, people working part-time, very low-earning, self-employed. And the policy design around universal credit is to try to help all of those households increase their hours. So the design of universal credit in terms of having expectations of people, unless they are caring, to work more, including second earners, and for people to increase their hours and to be able to move smoothly from out of work into work with smooth incentives to increase their hours. That the policy design is all quite consistent with the analysis of the problem of what's driving in-work poverty, and that was the point that I was making.
Problem is that the policy design isn't what's happening in the real world. In the real world, there are people that are suffering under the current regime, and to say that we were going to transfer this migration to those in work, you know, there's no credibility for the DWP currently as we stand.
But that's your opinion. I don't recognise the world you're describing. You know, lots of people are talking about these problems. I admit we do not get it right every time.
Searle, that you don't recognise that world and you're working actually to be helping these people.
I go on to say, and Denise may come, you know, I go out to job centres, talking to our work coaches, talking to claimants, you know, on a very regular basis. I was in a job centre on Monday. Denise will do it even more frequently than me. Actually, our work coaches, I go on to say, are fabulous people, really committed to making a positive difference to people's lives. They feel very strongly, very passionately, that the move to universal credit enables them to do that much more effectively than the legacy system. I go back, do we always get it right? No, sometimes we do get it wrong, and where we do fail customers, we want to hear about it, we want to try and put it right as quickly as possible. But the great majority of customers, I believe, we're making a positive difference for.
Sometimes it's more than sometimes it's the majority of cases that we get are on a negative in universal credit. If you ask anyone in the public about universal credit, they would not come back to you and say it's a well-designed system. But moving on from that scenario, Mr Searle said about the fact that we test and learn and it's very light touch. You know, I would say, and I've said before, it's more like test and ignore as the system's rolled out. But one of the things that we've had, you said as time moved on, Mr Searle, you then went and said from very light touch you moved on to we have no expectations of people in work. So what does that mean then? Have you changed your mind during today's discussion, or are you not going to have conditionality? Are you not? Because you did say we have no expectations of people in work.
I mean, I think I've already said it, but I can repeat it. So we call the regime light touch conditionality, but you know, for all the reasons I've set out, in practice now, we are not expecting our work coaches to have a lot of conversations, spend a lot of time helping people in work to progress, because we want to increase our evidence base to fill the gaps that your colleague talked about earlier on, so we really understand what the benefits could be of different interventions so that we can help people to progress in work and address in-work poverty.
With the greatest respect, we're talking about families in work who are on the current tax credit system, who are living on the edge financially. How are they going to feel that that's confident that you're just going to say it's going to be very light touch, everyone's okay, the system's had problems in the past, but it's okay now and it should be okay for you? That still goes back to my original question of lacking credibility.
I disagree. If someone's working, I mean, I feel like I'm being criticised for two different things. So if someone's working, doing the best they can at the moment, then you know, absolutely, I don't think it would concern them, particularly that we're letting them progress in work on their own. We do want to help them further, and that's something we're looking to develop, we're looking to test, we're looking to learn, and we will implement changes if we think they're appropriate in a number of years' time. Right now, we're focusing on helping people to move into work rather than helping them progress once they're in work. That is no different to the current tax credit system. So if someone's on tax credits, they're not given any additional support to progress in work. So it's a continuation of the existing system. We do want to improve it, but we want to make sure we improve it in the right way.
Mr Searle, finally, Convener, Mr Searle, the whole situation is that you're talking about testing, and as my colleague already said, these are real people with real lives, and you're using them as guinea pigs in a system that you're not, that already previously, before you go into in-work, individuals that are working, you know, the system has had serious flaws, you know, and you're just carrying on regardless. And that's the concerns for these people that we're dealing with. It's real people with real lives and real families.
For me, it's about continuous improvement, and I firmly believe in all walks of life, all systems, all people should focus on continuous improvement. That's the approach we're taking. I think if we or any other department, any other agency rolled out a system and said this is perfect, we're not changing it, then we would rightly be criticised. What we're doing is rolling something out that we think is good, but recognising that everything could be improved and making sure we have that continuous feedback. We test, we learn, we improve. That's the way we're operating the system.
Learning, no.
No, well, I did give you a list of about 10 things that the government has changed over the course of the last year. Doesn't strike me as ignoring. I think a couple of points on universal credit that's really important to understand. First, universal credit now, post-budget, costs more, is more generous on aggregate than the legacy system it replaces. So in 2023, it will cost £2 billion more. We will spend £2 billion more through universal credit. It's a more generous system on aggregate. And the other point, crucially, which I think is really important, I imagine the committee will be concerned about, is there are real issues because of the complexity of the current system around take-up. So lots of people, both out of work and in work, don't take up all their entitlements. Universal credit, because it's one system, you claim one thing, you get the whole lot, will be greatly beneficial to people in ensuring they take up all of their entitlements. So that's over £2 billion a year additional money going to some of the poorest in society because of universal credit who wouldn't get it under the legacy system. So some very important positive changes under universal.
For me, it's the policy intention and reality seem to be the gulf. That's the point I've been trying to get across.
Just a genuine difference of opinion there. Mr. Lindhurst, just before I move to you, Mr. Lindhurst, I promised to ask a specific question, which I don't expect you to answer. You can write to me afterwards if you want, but I've held 5 information events in my constituency so far in relation to the rollout of universal credit, supported by citizens' advice, supported by local housing associations, welfare rights officers, and they'll be positive and get a lot of information to vulnerable people out there. But I got a specific question after one of the events from a employability and education advisor in one of the community areas. I'm just going to read it out. As it was said, the question I asked was about the support available for refugees who have no or scant English. These poor souls have to apply for 7 jobs a week, many while studying ESOL part-time at college with no computer skills. We have a couple of refugees participating in our computer classes, and from what I have witnessed, even with English at pre-intermediate level, they take twice as long to pick up the vocabulary required to learn and understand computers. What support's available for this group? It's a very, very specific question, but there are people with additional barriers to accessing a digital by default system. It could be English as a second language, people who have came through the asylum process and now have the right to work and claim benefits in the country. It could be the learning disabled. It could be a whole variety of others. Now, for time constraints, with your permission, I do want to move to Mr. Lindhurst, but I promised to ask that very specific question. Can I get a commitment that we can get a response to that? And perhaps Denise Horsfall, if that's
no problem,
if that's okay.
Absolutely,
I would really welcome that. Mr. Lindhurst.
Yes, thank you, Convener. I think from your answers to questions, you recognise there have been various problems and difficulties with the system, and also that it needs to be developed, improved, and so forth as it's rolled out, and as we move into the future, if I understood you correctly. I just want to come back on one point. I think the suggestion was made to you that a system like this, indeed one with conditionality, has never been tried anywhere else in the world. Now, I'm just looking at the German system, for example, just looking at the website about that, where conditionality seems to be inbuilt into the system. Now, obviously, it's not the same as our system, and there are other European systems that one could look to where a very different approach to the previous UK approach to benefits is taken. Are you able to counter the suggestion that conditionality is something that is new on this in this world's understanding of this sort of system?
I mean, it's a very important question. Absolutely, conditionality is not new and is not unique to the UK, and it's something in this country, has been very well tried and tested for people who are out of work. So, you know, we've got an awful lot of experience, an awful lot of evidence, very robust evidence about what works in terms of conditionality to help people move into work. What is not been greatly tested internationally and not been greatly tested here yet is that, well, what about when people have moved into work but they could work more? What you know, what could help them to progress? What form of conditionality, what form of interventions might actually help people to progress? That's the thing that I think we do need further evidence on, and that we've committed to do further work to investigate before we roll out any further changes.
And the conditionality that we see in other European systems, and indeed the intention of ours, is it not to try and help people into work and assist them in their own particular circumstances? Do you agree that should be the goal of it?
That absolutely should be the goal, and that is the approach that we look to take. As I said, you know, the claimant commitment, the work coaches are, you know, really supporting, working with, forming good, positive relationships with the customers they have, helping them to progress, and you know, behind that, we do need that backstop, I think, of sanctions, but it is in a small minority of cases that we need to invoke that. The great majority of people, the great majority of relationships are very constructive. People do what they've committed to, and that helps them to move into work.
And can I just add to that, which is, you know, this balance of conditionality is also about making sure that the support is there and that we wrap around services so people can progress. So conditionality is only an expression of what can you do, and it's about trying to test the best that somebody can do. If they advise us that there are issues, or they've got gaps in their CV, or they've got gaps in their skills, it's what can we do to connect with other services that are around. So Skills Development Scotland, I can see in the future, and currently we're very close to them, but in the future will be a really good source of connectivity for our customers. We use them now, we use the World of Work, we have relationships with Skills Development Scotland, but I can see that connection for this group of people being very strong.
Okay. Alasdair Allan?
Yes, thanks. It was really just to pick up on some of the discussion there that came out of the questions which Alison Johnson asked about tax credits. And obviously, and this has come through, obviously you'll appreciate that it will come as a big surprise to many people who've been receiving tax credits that the system is to be migrated in the future from HRC, as they would see it, to DWP. So I just wondered if you can offer a rationale for why that having happened, that should be a reason for those people reapplying, or in many cases would feel they would have to reapply for the benefits that they got out of the tax credit system. Because, forgive me, but anecdotally, dealing as we do with constituents, I would reckon that the awareness that this is on the horizon is very low. So what's the rationale for people having to reapply for something they think they already have?
Well, partly it's a legal rationale. So legally, we couldn't just deem someone to have made a claim for universal credit. We can't pay someone universal credit without them having formally made a claim. So that's the process we have to initiate through that managed migration. I say again that yes, I accept that many people on tax credits now won't really understand, expect to be moved onto universal credit in a couple of years' time, 3 years' time. And to be honest, many of them might not expect to be on tax credits in 2 or 3 years' time. Their circumstances could change quite dramatically. What we will commit to do is to make sure we communicate with them early, we warm them up at the right time, we're clear about what they will have to do, what the timescales will be, what the process will be, and help people to move across to universal credit in as smooth a way as possible.
But given that these are people who have really, in many cases, have had very little dealing with the benefit system as they would understand it, what modelling has been done to try to assess how many of the current group who would benefit from tax credits would even begin to have any knowledge that this is on the horizon? I mean, obviously, I'm dealing here, and others here, we admit we're dealing in anecdotes, but quite a substantial number of them, given our contact that we have with constituents. What I'm not hearing is as yet, any evidence that sustained modelling has been done to try to estimate in the UK how many millions of people understand that tax credits are going to become a thing of the past in their present form, and that they will have to go through a reapplication process. Has any study been done of that, or any attempt to measure it?
Personally, I think what's important is that in 2 years' time, in 3 years' time, when it becomes time for those people to move across to universal credit, that with the right sort of notice, they know what they have to do. They're aware then, not that they're aware 2 or 3 or 4 years ahead of time. So our focus for the next 2-3 years is to really make sure we get that process right, to make sure we know how we can engage with all those tax credit customers, so they do know that they're going to be switched across when they need to know. Actually, it can alarm people or frighten people unnecessarily if you tell them something's going to happen in 2 or 3 years when their circumstances could have changed dramatically. So our focus is on getting the process right. When we get the process right, then we will try and model whether we think some people might fall out of that process, how many people might not be aware, and to be honest, we'll then try and fill that gap by improving the process design rather than accepting that some people will just miss out. We don't want anyone to miss out.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, can I just give a time check for the benefit of our witnesses as well as MSPs? I think it's been quite a long session. We're running for another 20 minutes or so, and so far I know our Deputy Convener wants to come back in, as does Michelle Ballantyne. So anyone wanting to come in, catch my eye, time is gradually running out. Pauline McNeill?
Just to quickly follow up on Alasdair Allan, I have to say I think you're kidding yourselves if you think that people who are in current receipt of tax credit will not be alarmed. And I just put this to you for food for thought. The reason is that a lot of the people on tax credits, and it has been a successful system, or maybe you don't think so, have not had any engagement with the benefit system at all and don't regard themselves as benefit receivers. There's a fundamental change in the way that people are going to perceive now in the move to the DWP that they regard. And I have to say, I could sympathise with that, because if you've been working hard for 30 years doing your best and getting a little bit of help from the state, and now you're told, oh, by the way, you're going to be treated as if you were unemployed and all your benefits, all your tax credits will be managed by, and you can't even tell this committee with any confidence how you're going to plan for that. I think that's a serious concern to me. I would like to put some figures to Donna, if you don't mind. So these are figures that the committee asked for from SPICE, just to get some, I mean, they are obviously selective figures, and I'll let you have them, but they take 2 key examples. So there's a net household incomes after housing costs and childcare costs. The first example is of a lone parent with 2 children, aged 2 and 5, the national living wage. So average house costs, as I say, and no childcare costs. I will give you this. I mean, you don't have to answer it today. But in the cases of some who work 12 hours and then 24 hours, and then examples who work 40 hours, in every single case, they are substantially worse off under universal credit by quite a bit. Then you take the second example that SPICE have given as a couple with 2 children, aged 2 and 5, the national living wage. So that's a couple, not a single earner. There is one case where they are slightly better off, and in the other 2 cases, they're the same or lower. So the figures that we are being given don't bear out the evidence that you've given us this morning, where there are, I mean, because that is a fair example, I think, of a family with 2 children, and they're worse off under universal credit. And what we've been hearing all morning is how successful it is. So any response you want to give us would be helpful, but perhaps you might want to respond to the committee in time, and I'll let you have the actual workings.
I was difficult you would actually have those figures in front of you, but Donna Ward, could you try and address that?
So there definitely are winners and losers. So typically families with children are likely to gain if they work relatively few hours. I mean, the person on 12 hours, they ought not to have qualified for tax credits at all. I mean, I'll obviously have to look at the example. So, whereas they would qualify for universal credit. And then it also depends whether people make use of the childcare offer and other things. So there are winners and losers because we're bringing in people into the in-work benefit system even if they only work 1 or 2 hours, whereas the tax credit system was very much at particular points on the earnings distribution. So I'm not surprised there are some losers, but there are also some gainers, and I'll be really happy to look at those figures.
And just to reiterate, we will be spending more on universal credit than on the legacy system. So on average, people will gain. Some people, as you say, and significant numbers of people will receive less than they would have done. We're happy to work through those cases and other cases to support you. I should go back on the point you made at the outset there about tax credit cases, and we're not proposing to treat those people as if they are someone who's not complying with their claimant commitment and is out of work. We're proposing to treat them with respect, help them, give them the support they need, automatically adjust their universal credit without any great need for them to contact us. We think it will be a smooth and easy system, and that's what we're looking to make sure is the case. So you know, I don't think they need to be scared.
Okay. Pauline.
I'm happy to.
Yep. Okay. Michelle Ballantyne.
Okay, thank you. Just to follow up that, I should probably mention, because Pauline didn't, that the figures she gave were based on UC in 2016, so it takes no account of the budget changes and the changes that have been made over the last year and a half. In terms of tax credits, can you confirm, well, I know it's the case, but actually you have to apply for your tax credits every year. So it isn't just a rolling thing that continues. And there is a period where you have to apply, and if you miss the deadline, it's not renewed and you have to start again. So in reality, the changeover will be just a different application. And actually on the website for tax credits, it clearly states that will be moving to universal credit. So people are being given notice every year at the moment as they reapply and as they come to apply. So that information is there. But I just wanted to ask you a couple of things. Journals. Journals are a really important factor of universal credit. And there have been some complaints about journals not being answered. So people putting information onto their journals and then it not actually getting a quick response. Now, my understanding is that there should be a response within 48 hours of a journal being placed on there. So can you just sort of update the committee what issues you have, what is being done to resolve those, and you know, what can we expect if we're asking the same question in 6 months or a year in terms of that performance around journals?
Yes, so journals, you're right, form part of the way that we interact with customers now. We advise them to use their journal. Some of our customers do believe it's web chat. You know, there is a problem where, you know, if somebody's got an urgent issue, then they tend to use the journal and then pick up the phone, to be honest. So, and we would want them to stay on the digital format if we could. So at the moment, if I go back 6 months, I would have been saying to you, I had some concerns because we were just implementing and actually our resources were behind the curve, not in front. We're in front of the curve now. I was out in my service centres last week and every team are getting through their journals. Not on a Monday. Monday is a heavy lifting day because we're closed over weekend. People use their journals over the weekend and we also come back to a number of payments. So Mondays are a particular issue for us, which we're thinking about at a UK level of how we deal with that Monday load. But the rest of the week, we should be getting to our journals. Now, that's in the case management system. Work coaches, again, it depends upon their, at the point that they're in the rollout. The first 3 months after rollout, it's a transformation for them. It's, you know, we've talked about this is different for customers, different for them. They have to get used to managing their workload slightly differently. So I've got no doubt that, unfortunately, we probably might have missed a few along the way. But 3 months after that, after we've rolled, we're normally back on top of it. So I would be concerned if you were finding any examples once we hit March of any significant issues, because obviously we're still rolling out, you know, historical sites, you know, should be on top of it, but new sites might be having a little bit of a problem going through those early weeks.
Monitor, I mean, are the statistics around that kind of waiting time, that 48-hour sort of response time?
I mean, the way we run the business is through team leaders and work coach team leaders. So we run it very much about the team leaders have got a set of 10 case managers. They are with them every day, looking at what they have a dashboard. So they have a dashboard, you've seen a dashboard of information. They will look in on every single one of those dashboards and make sure that they're on top. If they're not, then actually colleagues help around. So it's about active management, and that's the same with the work coach team leaders.
Okay, thank you. And the other question I just wanted to touch on was around the childcare element. Again, there's been some concerns around having to pay the childcare up front, which can be quite significant if you've got a couple of children that are in childcare. Now, I know there's a process through the job centres, work coaches, etc., of cards where they can put their concerns or things that are worrying that you then pass through and look back. So I'm just wondering, with the childcare, how much concern is coming through, and is there anything in the pipeline around how we resolve some of that burden of upfront payment for people?
It's partly a policy and an operation.
Yeah.
question.
Shall I start with a policy? I think that in policy terms, my understanding, and I'd have to take this away to make absolutely sure, is that, you know, actually we can pay people a month in advance of them actually moving into work, because we recognise that people may have to, you know, set up childcare arrangements and get children in those childcare arrangements before they've actually started in work. So there is that sort of system in place. We've also made improvements over the course of the last year or so that people can automatically upload their childcare costs onto their account. So a much easier system than was the case before. So I think that's the position from a policy perspective, and as you probably know, it is more generous than the legacy system. So we pay up to 85% of costs up to a limit, compared to 70% under tax credits.
And I think it is a bit of a catch-22, which I will take away. I don't know how many jury tickets have been raised. Sorry, these are the tickets that go up nationally. I will check. But it is a bit of a catch-22, isn't it? Which is, we want verification, but actually, you know, some childcare providers won't provide verification of cost until actually the cost is paid. So let me have another look at it and see what it's telling us.
Because I think it is an issue for people. Thank you.
Okay, I think we probably should touch on, before we close, the issue around delayed payments in relation to the 5-week wait, which is, and I know there's some changes, the 5-week wait in terms of the minimum wait that people have to go through before they receive benefits, and the information Trussell Trust gave out just recently in relation to, they recognised there was a 15% increase in food bank usage, but a year after universal credit's been rolled out, there was a residual 52% overall increase in food bank usage, and there was concerns a lot of that was tied towards that minimum 5-week delay. I think this committee previously looked at Dumfries where it was 8 or 9 weeks was the delays that were before I came onto the committee that was being experienced back in the day. Now, there was commitments in the UK budget and by the Secretary of State in relation to those in legacy benefits. When they transfer over, there'll be a 2-week follow through of benefits being received, which in theory would lead to a 3-week delay in benefit. Would that be an accurate description of that particular announcement?
I mean, effectively what it would mean, I'm not sure what stage job seekers allowance and income support are paid, but if we would be paying people 2 weeks additional benefit in, say, job seekers allowance, my guess is that would that be paid in advance, Denise, or would that be paid?
Job seekers is paid in arrears, isn't it?
So effectively that would be paid, let's say, 2 weeks into that 5 weeks, and then there's another 3-week wait before the first universal credit payment comes in, which is actually, I mean, I know, you know, time is quite important for people on very low incomes, but, you know, they would be waiting another 2 weeks anyway for the next job seekers allowance, so they're used to waiting that sort of length of time. But yes, that means that there is that effectively an interim payment of existing legacy benefits before their universal credit kicks in.
What would be a 5-week wait down to a 3-week wait for those transferring from legacy benefits was my understanding of the
Essentially, that's
of the
correct,
policy
yeah.
intent there.
Not
that
to tax credits, I should add, just
Right.
so you're clear.
Yeah.
But that's yeah.
Yeah. So that wouldn't kick in until July 2020 is my understanding. So I'm just wondering, would you have some concerns in relation to that? Because obviously that's the right thing to do. It's acknowledgement that things aren't working. That not kicking until July 2020 means there's been people let down just now by that gap.
I mean, it's additional support, so we're keen to try and help smooth that process as much as possible. July 2020, I believe you're right in terms of that timescale. We want to do it as early as we possibly can, but you'll appreciate that it does take time to build up the system changes and other guidance and so on for work coaches to be able to do that. In the interim, we do have the changes we've already made, so we've still got 100% advances that people can get, pretty well from week one.
To go into that in a second, were you wrong-footed by that July 2020 announcement? Because if it was a planned response to issues with the system, you guys have been good to go and just make that happen. So I don't think the Chancellor and the Secretary of State made this change out of the largesse and kindness of the UK government. They did it in response to key pressures in relation to what many see as flaws in the universal credit system. So I would hope that would be a planned change. And if it was a planned change, you guys would be good to go on that now. And the fact that it's July 2020 means many folk will be let down by that. Would you recognise that as a reality?
And I think, the Scottish Government will face the same sort of challenges that any other government, the UK government faces. You make a decision to make a change, it takes time to implement that change effectively. So, the Scottish Government is taking, understandably, a period of time to implement the policies it wants to bring in. You can't do these things overnight. That is the duration of time it will take us to do it.
Those would be planned changes, and I asked the question, were you cited on that? Were you a month ago, 2 months ago, 3 months ago part of a planning process to make this happen? I'm just wondering, is July 2020 plucked out of thin air, or what's the reality around that?
I mean, we have been developing that policy for a period of time, but we haven't been developing it for 2 years. So we don't decide something 2 years ago and then announce it 2 years later and roll it out the next day. We announce it relatively early in that development process, and then we implement it. Donna, sorry to interrupt.
I was just going to say it was one of the, it was part of a package of things that our Secretary of State asked the Treasury for to ease the managed migration. So yes, we recognise it's also an issue for new claims, but it was one of the things that we were specifically looking for to help ease managed migration, which is, will be therefore that timing kind of fits in with that. But obviously, if we could have had it earlier, that would have been even better. If we could have had the money and delivered it earlier, that would have been even better, but we couldn't.
So it's unfortunate that we can't accelerate that delivery. What about the point people would make, if this protection is there for people on legacy benefits and it's not there for new claimants, why would you have one group wait 3 weeks and another group wait a minimum of 5 weeks? There's a disparity and inequality there as well in relation to recourse to public funds. Would you recognise that?
These are different circumstances. So when you say new claims, I presume you mean new claims from people who aren't currently on benefit. Most of those people would be coming out of work. So actually most of those people will have a final payment from work that can tide them over for a period of time. Most payments are in arrears, so actually their circumstances will generally be very different to the circumstances of people on legacy benefits, hence the different treatment.
That obviously won't be forever. I'm just trying to go through some of these because reference was made at the start, an opening statement, to some of the changes in the budget. We haven't really referred to them just before we close this session. I understand that one of the issues I raised in a universal credit debate last week was in relation to the 12 months advance that people could get. We had information that people weren't always told they could get that advance, and before they were told about it, they were told, could you borrow money off a family or friends or anyone else before you got an advance? So is there a need to better train staff or clearer guidelines to staff so that people are made aware of their entitlement to an advance at the very point where they need that money, rather than saying to them, well, maybe your family members could help you out here?
I can assure you, Convener, that all my staff understand what an advance is and also how to offer it. But you're right, the recourse to public funds as an advance, the first question is, have you got any other recourse to other funding first? But it's not some sort of interrogation, it's just a question. Once somebody says no, it's immediately into how to make an advance. Also,
So I apologise, but I know some of my constituents, and I apologise for the discourtesy of interrupting you there, but I know some of my constituents who are just not used to dealing with that system will go, oh, maybe I'll see what I can do, and that would be the end of that particular conversation, and off they would go. These people do exist, and that will happen for some vulnerable people. So I'm just not sure about that question at the start. Maybe that's something that has to be reconsidered.
I mean, that is the training and that's the guidance and that's what's been agreed from a departmental point of view. So we're only following what we're being asked to do, and it's not unreasonable to ask somebody if actually they've got recourse to other funds. What I would say is that it's also online. If somebody is digitally able, they can apply for it online now immediately, so they can fill in those boxes, they can say what they want and don't want to inform us about. But actually I think it's probably the most simplest system that I've come across in the 40 years that I've been a public servant. So, you know, it is accessible to people both digitally, by the phone, or through work coaches.
There might just be a disagreement on that, and we're allowed to have that disagreement respectfully. That's absolutely fine. The 12-month payback period that we're referring to, that's being extended to 16 months, 18,
16 months, yeah.
But that would, so that's obviously an acknowledgement that when people get that advance, that the paying it back can be tough, because it started off at a 6 month, it had to be paid back over, then it was 12 months, it's now 16 months. It does feel as if it's taken a while, really taken a while to get right what a reasonable repayment period would look like, but that additional support doesn't kick in until October 2021. Why would that be?
Again, that's a question of how long it takes us to make the system changes. I would say on that pattern of changes, that 6 months went up to 12 because we were moving from 50% to 100%. So that was to keep the level of repayments at the same sort of level. 16 months is a further enhancement of the system. It will take us a while to introduce, yes.
I mean, were you aware that announcement was about to happen for the last few months? Was that in the pipeline?
I mean, it's the same answer as before. Yes, we've been working on that change for a number of weeks, straight months, and you know, it's been announced, and now we need to implement it at the earliest possible opportunity.
It seemed a pretty lengthy period of time to do something apparently simple as to say pays that money back over 16 months rather than 12 months. So we've got people having to wait to October 2021 to benefit from that. Do you think you could look again to bring that forward?
I think for many people, most people, probably 12 months will still be the right period. You know, we don't necessarily want people having a lower income for too long. We'll certainly go back and look at whether there's any way of bringing that in earlier, but my advice is actually, with all the other changes we've got to do, that's the earliest we can realistically do it.
Well, that's helpful that you look at see if we can bring that in earlier. Can I just ask you, with the same consistency then, this would be really helpful, the July 2020 date to bring in that continuation of 2 weeks of legacy benefit. Do you think you could look to accelerate that and bring that in sooner also?
I think it's highly unlikely that would be possible, because that's quite a significant change you know, and actually that's not that long a time frame to make a sort of change of that scale. So we're having to change a whole number of systems, the legacy systems as well as universal credit, to make that change. So I wouldn't want to walk away from here leaving you with any expectation that it would be possible to accelerate that time.
Right. Okay. Without expectation, will you try?
Sorry, would I try?
Without any expectation, will you at least try?
Well, I can go back and ask the question, but I am very confident that when the Chancellor and the Secretary of State announced that timetable, they had thought long and hard about how quickly we could implement it, and that was the date they thought it was, you know, the earliest possible sensible and safe date. So I sincerely doubt that there's any way me asking them would actually get them to change that.
I might say diplomatically, the Chancellor and the Secretary of State have got fluctuating timetables in relation to the whole issue of universal credit and the rollout. That seems to be a movable feast. But I'm conscious that I said the session was going to come to a close. I should point out that Shona Robison, MSP, has not been able to join us for much of this morning's session because of quite significant constituent issues in relation to the Michelin plant. where there could be a looming closure. So I'm not going to finish just now. Shona, do you have any questions you want to ask just before we move on from this session?
Thanks, Convener. That would be really helpful. My apologies for having to leave earlier. I did want to ask something which I understand hasn't been asked so far about the tax credit cases, where there's obviously been a delay in moving them across. And it was two specific questions. One on, because people on tax credits are going to have to apply, so some of them won't know anything about this, that they're obviously dealing with HMRC, not the DWP. A lot of them will not know that this is coming, and the fact that, as I understand it, they will have to apply for universal credit. Is there an assumption of an attrition rate there that have you in your modelling assumed that there will be a certain percentage of those cases that don't apply for universal credit?
We did get into this a little bit earlier
right,
when
my
you weren't around.
apologies.
But, I mean, my answer was we're working really hard over the course of the next 2 years as we build up our plans around making those transitions from tax credits to universal credit to make sure everyone knows what the process is, and if they do want to claim universal credit, they don't have to, that's a choice, but if they do, that they do so. So, you know, we're planning for a 0% attrition rate. That's our determined objective. As we move forward and as we get closer, you know, we may think realistically a certain proportion of people will, hopefully for choice rather than for any failure on our part, not take up universal credit when they previously would have taken up tax credits. We might then build that into our modelling, but that's for much later in the process rather than something we do now. Right now, we want to plan for success.
Are you writing to them to let them know this is happening?
We'll write to them a number of months before they're due to transfer. So the large-scale migration from tax credits to universal credit won't start until November 2020, and it will then carry on. Well, the migration as a whole will carry on for around 3 years. So many months before that, before the individual is due to transfer, we will write to them. We want to give them suitable notice, but not so much notice that they've forgotten by the time it gets there.
I know one of the issues at the moment is the regulations are being looked at around transitional protection, and we have explored a little bit in the evidence previously around the need for those regulations to recognise particular circumstances and have an element of discretion. So obviously transitional protection would exist to guarantee someone's income unless there's a change of circumstances. There's obviously concerns about what those change of circumstances may be. So, for example, someone fleeing domestic abuse, we wouldn't want them in a position of being concerned to do that if it was going to then impact on their income. So the regulations as they're being drafted, are those the kind of issues that are being looked at around the drafting to make sure that there would be discretion in those kinds of cases?
I mean, the regulations are now, they've been laid before the UK Parliament, so they were laid on Monday. So those are the regulations. They will be debated, and we'll see what the UK Parliament makes of those. It doesn't include that sort of provision. In those sorts of cases, someone's circumstances would have changed quite dramatically. Certainly we wouldn't want to encourage to do anything that would lead someone to stay in a relationship that they shouldn't stay in. I would hope that our processes wouldn't wouldn't cause that sort of problem. What we talked about earlier on is the fairly intensive support and training that we give to our people to make sure they're alive to domestic abuse issues, and they can help people address those and connect them with people who are more expert to help them in the local community.
I can understand the concern, though, here that, you know, if the message is that a change of circumstance could disrupt your transitional protection arrangements, I think it's really important that people are aware that they can have those types of discussions and that they're not making choices based on the worry about losing that. So would you undertake to take that back and make sure that whether it's in guidance or, you know, that there's clear, that claimants are clear that, you know, that if there are circumstances like that they have the right to, and that would be looked at sympathetically? I think communication around this is really important.
Yeah, no, it is a very important issue, and I think I may have slightly misunderstood your question, because I was answering it in terms of people before they've been managed migrated, so before they've got transitional protection in place. You know, actually, I will need to check this, but my understanding is that we have looked at that case of, you know, once people have a family unit have migrated across, transitional protection is in payment, then we will do things to try and make sure that that is in some way protected. If you know, generally a wife feels they have to leave because of domestic abuse, then that is something I believe that we have addressed, but I do need to check that.
To us with
Absolutely
clarification
will do.
about
Yes,
that, please,
yes.
because that'd be helpful. Thank you. Thanks, Convener.
Okay, that's us for this particular evidence session. It's been lengthy evidence session. We covered a lot of ground, and we're very appreciative at the information you've given us. If you go away and you think, I want to clarify something, we'd love you just to correspond with the committee and update us. I know, Denise Horsfall, I kind of put you on the spot a little bit about one particular issue. We haven't really explored some of the additional barriers in relation to people with English as a second language or learning disabilities or other disabilities and using the digital by default system. And there are significant challenges there, so anything you could provide in relation to that would be very welcome. But more generally, just thank you for your openness and frankness in helping us grasp how we're going to draw our conclusions in relation to how social security and work poverty relates to each other. So thank you all of you for your time this morning, and we now move to agenda item 3, thank you, which is in subordinate legislation, and the committee is invited to consider the Council Tax Reduction Scotland Amendment number 3 regulations 2018, which are subject to a negative procedure. Can I refer members to paper 3, a note by our clerk? The DPLR committee drew the regulations to the attention of the Parliament on the grounds of a drafting error which has been acknowledged by the Scottish Government, and a correction will be made early in the new year. The DPLR committee also repeated their view that the instrument raised a devolution issue as highlighted previously with council tax reduction instruments. The committee's role is to consider the policy, and the committee is invited to note the instrument. In noting, the committee may wish to support the DPLR committee's view that if the Scottish Government assesses that the drafting error could have some unintended effects, it would be preferable to bring forward an amendment to correct the error promptly, given the provisions come into force on the 28th of November. Is the committee content to highlight the DPLR committee's view and note the instrument? Are we agreed to do that? Your silence and your silent enthusiasm is noted for the record. Right. Okay. So thank you. So as we agreed at agenda item 1, we now move to agenda item 4, which we've previously agreed to take in private. So we now move into private session.